Welcome to VCR, a Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I'm Cleo the Whip Lady.
And welcome to part 2 of our Oscars series,
That's right.
covering the 1973 Oscars 50 years ago. In part 1, we touched on The Godfather, one of the greatest films of all time, that won Best Picture that year. And today we're covering Cabaret,
Which is also a movie that exists.
yes, a film that won 8 Oscars that year, which was some of the most Oscars ever won up until that point, and is still the movie with the most Oscars without winning Best Picture.
Really?
Picture.
Huh.
Yeah, it's a really interesting film to discuss and to discuss alongside The Godfather. But before we get into the film itself, I do have a couple of show notes that I want to mention quickly about The Godfather because we can't just stop talking about The Godfather.
Yeah, I guess not. This is the Godfather podcast now.
Yeah. So two things. The first is I watched The Godfather Part 2 last week. This my second watch of the film ever, and it's a really, really good film. It's much darker than the first film, and so I don't know if I appreciated it as much at the time, and it's still kind of occupying some space in my mind right now, and I'm still kind of chewing over all of the details of it. It's a very, very complicated film.
That's a good sign though, if
Yeah.
you're chewing over it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you and I saw the new Avatar together in December, and then we immediately both forgot about it.
Yeah. Every time you say it, I'm like, oh yeah, we watched
Yeah.
the Avatar Part 2. The second thing I wanted to quickly say is I also started watching The Offer last week, which is the TV miniseries that I mentioned in our previous episode as well. That's the miniseries based on Albert S. Ruddy, the producer of The Godfather, his experience trying to get The Godfather made.
Right. It's not a documentary. It's like
No,
it's like a docudrama, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's on Paramount Plus. I gotta say, if you really enjoyed our Godfather episode, then you should really do yourself a favor and check that out because it pretty much a lot of what we discussed they portray in the miniseries, and it's fantastic. Like it's such a compelling story of how it got made and how it almost didn't get made, and like the involvement of the mob and everything.
Yeah.
There's some really great performances in it, especially Matthew Good as the kind of sleazy movie executive at Paramount Plus, or sorry, not at
You know
Paramount
what?
Plus.
I'll just say this. Matthew Good, he's great at sleaze.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? I think I've only really seen him in Watchmen and the Benedict Cumberbatch numbers game
yeah.
thing movie. I can't remember what it was called, but he's always good at playing like sleaze.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but
And his performance, like he's good. He puts on this accent that's impossible to pinpoint where it's from, but
okay.
it's a really good role, and I would recommend it for that reason. It's also like really cool because it kind of shows you the background of Hollywood in the 70s, in the early 70s, as this movie's getting made, and it shows kind of like the behind the scenes look of making a movie and kind of everything that happens in it. Also, there's a really fun performance with an actor portraying Frank Sinatra because of the
Right.
drama involved with Frank Sinatra.
You mean
and-
not Johnny Fontaine?
and being not
Yeah.
Johnny Fontaine. So
Jeez.
that also is quite entertaining in the film, and how he's connected. And obviously, like, we don't know for sure, like, if he got connected with the mob afterwards, but there's some, like, Frank Sinatra wants this movie kiboshed, so we're also going to do him a favor and try to get this movie kiboshed as well.
Man, who was I talking to about this recently? I was talking to someone about this recently about how, like, you never want to be an asshole, but like sometimes it's beneficial to be friends with assholes.
Yeah.
To have an asshole on your side. Actually, on that note,
So I've made all these friends all these years.
yeah, is that why you've kept me around for 30 years? But I did a little bit of further reading on The Godfather myself, and the one thing that I found really interesting about it was how nobody expected it to be a masterpiece.
Right.
Like, Mario Puzo just wrote it because he was in debt and he really needed the money. Francis Ford Coppola just needed money for his new studio. Like,
Yeah, and because he was in debt.
yeah, this movie was fueled by debt. So, and I guess like the producers hated it and they kept threatening to fire Francis Ford Coppola.
Right.
So like he had to take sedatives at night because he was so stressed out he couldn't sleep, and like none of the actors had a good time shooting it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because like I've mentioned a couple times on this podcast that I do have my own little creative projects, and like sometimes you do something and you're like, wow, this sucks. And then you show it to people and they're like, wow, this is amazing. And you're like, really? And then other times you're like, hey, like, check this out. It's amazing. And people are like, yeah, whatever. So it's astonishing and kind of funny to me that, like, you know, nobody really wanted to make this movie, but
Right.
it turned out to be like, imagine working on something, thinking it's hot garbage, just doing it because you're in debt. And then you wake up one day and suddenly, like, it turns out you've invented the best things at sliced bread.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
that's what you're known for the rest of your life.
Yeah, basically.
Sliced bread.
That thing you hated. Like, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think Mario Puzo, like, I guess he wrote some, like, literary novel kind of that was sort of based on his mom before The Godfather, and it didn't do well. Nobody really liked it. And then he did The Godfather, and it blew up. And I think I read somewhere that towards the end of his life, he regretted that other novel didn't take off, but
Right.
The Godfather did.
Yeah, and you know what? It even explores that a little bit in The Offer. So I would recommend that show to you, I guess, at this point,
It
because
sounds good.
it's worth a watch. If you're a fan of The Godfather, and I'm sure most of you are, it's good. It's a very cool retelling of how this movie got made.
Right.
But anyway, we should move on to another movie that we're actually talking about today called
Cabaret.
which also
Yeah.
came out in 1972. Do you want to take away with plot?
Yeah, sure. So, Sally Bowles is a cabaret singer in Berlin in 1931 when no major social upheavals were happening around her. And she's your classic manic pixie dream girl. She's loud, she's boisterous, she loves smoking and drinking and dancing and sex. And Brian Roberts, a PhD student from Britain, just so happens to come knocking one day looking for lodging, and they strike up an unlikely friendship and maybe romance down the line.
Question mark.
Question mark. And anyways, things kind of springboard from there. What's interesting about this movie is that it is a musical, but it's unconventional in that it's all diegetic. Like, the
Yeah.
characters don't randomly, like,
break out into song.
yeah, the fourth wall is pretty firmly fortified. So, yeah, all the musical numbers take place on stage as we're watching them.
Yeah, and they all kind of allude to what's going to happen next to the characters.
Yeah, in kind of a vague, sort of foreshadowy kind of way.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's one of, like, the highlights of the film for me personally, is kind of how each musical number leads into where we're going to follow the characters next.
It's almost like each musical number is like an epigraph to, like, a new chapter.
Mm-hmm. You did a good job of summarizing the opening of the plot. There's a lot of
Thanks,
different
buddy.
themes kind of moving in and out of the plot. Like, there's a very queer element. This is probably our most queer-friendly film that we've done so far. There's the elements of, like, this kind of boiling to the surface Nazi movement starting to happen in Germany at this time.
You know what it kind of reminded me of just now as I'm thinking about it? It's like Jesus and Ben-Hur.
Yeah,
Kind of just in the background, building.
yeah.
It's not really, it's sort of just like this, it's this looming, lingering threat that's almost always just out of sight.
Because Jesus was such a looming, lingering threat the
The
whole
metaphor
time.
broke down a little, but yeah.
No, I get what you mean. I actually do like the comparison there, because I think, and I want to discuss this more when we get into spoilers, but there's a good question of, like, what is this movie really about? Is it about the relationships? Is it about Sally Bowles? Is it about the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany?
I liked that this is a very queer movie, especially for the time.
Mhm.
And it has all these queer themes, but then there's also, fascism bubbling to the surface
Right.
at the same time,
Yeah.
which is historically not been kind to non-heteronormative things.
Yeah, like anything that really is against the norm.
Yeah,
more
basically.
or less.
So
And that really paints the relationship aspect of the film in a very interesting light, because this is a high contrast film.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
But anyway, actually, before I get into characters and people you may know, I did want to mention, for people who maybe aren't as into the know of musicals or what a cabaret is, I had to Google this myself, but a cabaret is a live entertainment consisting of dancing, singing, or comedy acts that are performed in the evening, usually at a restaurant or a nightclub. And in this case, it's at a German nightclub. It's kind of almost feels like a basement or like a, almost like an underground scene kind of
It
place.
feels very, yeah, underground is a good word for it. Like, it feels very transgressive or like almost, yeah, like almost kind of hidden.
Yeah, it's cool.
It is cool.
Characters of people you may know. So Sally Bowles is kind of our central character with which all plot points really pivot around.
Yeah.
And you described her really well. And I think at one point the film describes her as an endearing child. And as I was trying to kind of put my thumb on what I would describe her as, and as soon as somebody said that in the film, I was like, that is exactly it, what she is portraying. She's a very interesting character because, there isn't a lot of consequence to her. Like she just kind of goes through life doing whatever she wants, and having fun and kind of acting out and just having a good time and not really caring too much about consequences.
Yeah. And there's also there's depth to her, but there's also lack of depth. I found very intentional, and I appreciate it a little bit.
Yeah, and so the actor playing Sally Bowles is Liza Minnelli, a very, very influential actor of the 70s and 80s, who actually happens to also be Judy Garland's daughter, one of the most famous actors of all time, playing Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. I did not know that.
Yeah, I knew that connection. And
congratulations, Liza Minnelli.
so Liza Minnelli is, like I said, she's very culturally significant. She was an actress, singer, dancer, choreographer. So she is also kind of known for the song New York, New York from the film New York, New York, which is a Martin Scorsese musical.
Martin Scorsese did a musical.
Yeah, with Robert De Niro alongside Liza Minnelli.
I can feel brain cells dying. I had no idea those guys did musicals.
Yeah.
I guess we should talk about this a little later, but I guess this is kind of coming at the tail end of the Hollywood musical, right? Maybe not the tail end, maybe a little bit later. Was it like the 50s that there were all these like musicals blowing up?
Yeah, maybe there was some then. I don't know if I know enough about musical history to say one way or another, to be honest.
Then maybe we should save this for another day.
But yeah, so she, like, all of those songs, like Maybe This Time, she's very well known for. She's considered to be a gay icon, and a large part of that is because of this film. Even though she herself isn't queer in the film. She starred in the film Arthur, which is a very famous romantic comedy. But modern audiences, where you're going to know her from, is Arrested Development.
Yes, I was waiting for you to bring that up.
Yes, where she plays Lucille Ostero, the neighbor of Lucille, the patriarch of the family.
Right, the matriarch
of the family. Yes, sorry.
She has a very ill-fated romance with Buster.
Yes.
And I think maybe Michael later on too.
Yeah, it's been a while since I watched that show.
Yeah, spoilers. But
that's what I know her from, because that came out at a very influential time in my TV and movie watching.
I would if you hadn't brought it up, I would have brought it up, because I feel like that's, for people our age, that's probably our best point of comparison, or where we would most know her from.
Yeah, absolutely. And she kills it. Like, this is a really good role for her. You know what? I actually don't want to talk about this too much, because I want to talk about this in my analysis, but I think she does a really great job with her performance in this film.
Yeah, no, we'll talk about this more later, but like, I was watching this movie today. I watched it today because I left it to the last minute.
Son of a bitch.
Because I'm a shitty friend, and of course, I'm a shitty friend and a worse correspondent. But anyways, I was watching the movie today, and I was like, I don't know if I like this character or not. I'm so ambivalent towards her.
I am very much on the same page with you there, and let's talk about it later in spoilers. So, our next character is Brian Roberts, how did you describe him again?
He's a PhD student from jolly old England.
Yes. So he's just arrived in Berlin at this time. He finds some lodging where Sally Bowles is staying, and he is like a painfully shy guy.
He's a great contrast to Sally because he's so British, for lack of a better term. Like, he's just very button up, very prim, very proper, very quiet.
Yeah, reserved.
Yeah, not super sexually experienced, as we find out. But, yeah.
And he's played by Michael York. Did you recognize him when you first saw this film? Because I instantly recognized him.
No.
So modern audiences, this is where I recognized him from. He is Basil Exposition in Austin Powers.
Don't be mad. I've never seen Austin
How have you
Powers.
never seen an Austin
I
Powers
just had this
movie?
conversation with my roommate. I've never seen Austin
Oh
Powers.
man, he's a very relevant character to those films, and anyone who listening who knows who that is gonna laugh out loud when they put that together. But yes, this is the actor who's playing it. He also stars in Logan's Run, which is one of the few very influential sci-fi films that I've never seen.
That's also a British movie, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know.
I think maybe.
Maybe. He's stars in Three Musketeers as well as Murder on the Orient Express, which is a very, very famous film, which recently had a shitty sequel. Or not a shitty sequel, a shitty remake. He has a very distinct British voice.
Yeah, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like he's probably done some voice acting work.
He's done a lot of voice acting work, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s is where you've heard of him. Like, he was on a few episodes of Simpsons, that sort of thing.
Okay.
However, other than like Austin Powers, there's not a lot of modern stuff he's been in, especially in the last 10 years, because unfortunately he's had some health issues in recent years, so he hasn't really been involved in that much. But if you've seen Austin Powers, you know exactly who I'm talking about with Basil Exposition.
You know what I couldn't stop thinking when I was looking at him?
What?
I was like, is this Chris Pine? Did Chris Pine go back in time?
Chris Pine?
Chris Prime. Chris Prime.
Christmas Prime.
Yeah, Chris Pine, from Wonder Woman. I was just like, did this motherfucker travel back in time so he could star in this movie?
I can barely see the resemblance, but I'll give you half a point for that one.
Half
a point, Hufflepuff.
I deserve it. I had a conversation at a party on Friday.
Huh?
What is Hufflepuff? I've never read Harry Potter. I know I know Gryffindor's brave, Slytherin is ambitious, Ravenclaw's smart. What's Hufflepuff's deal? Are they just kind of the normal people?
It's based on the Big Bad Wolf, where he says, "I'll huffle and I'll puffle and I'll blow your house down." No, I'm just trying to mess with people and get people mad. I couldn't tell you, honestly.
Okay.
They're probably the most awkward house out of all the houses.
So we'd be Hufflepuffs.
I don't know. I'm probably a Slytherin.
Okay. I'm a Ravenclaw on a good day, but a Hufflepuff most other days.
Maybe I could be qualified as a Ravenclaw, but I'm probably one of those two.
Anyways,
Anyway.
now back to VCR.
Yeah.
Regularly scheduled programming.
So our next character, it's hard to call him a character. I mean, he really is a character, but the Master of Ceremonies, or the MC, who is in all of the musical numbers.
When I saw that he was nominated for an Academy Award for this movie, I was kind of like, really?
Yeah.
Like, it's not that he did a bad job. It's just, you're right. He's barely a character.
He's more like a natural force throughout the film.
I'd almost see him more as almost like some kind of like supernatural guide. I'm picturing like Charon from Greek mythology, who's like guides the dead across the river.
Right.
Or like Virgil in Dante's Inferno, where it's just like, and now this, like, look at this. So I came up with some.
It's an incredible performance, but it's really hard to like say that he's a character within the film, because he's just more of like a driving force.
Well, we don't really. He's just, every time we see him, he's performing.
Yeah.
We don't really get any interiority from him.
Right.
Granted, he's a great performer. Like the actor, what was his name? Like
Joel Grey.
Joel Grey. Yeah, he's fantastic.
And so Joel Grey, he's actually reprising his role from the original musical of Cabaret.
Good for him.
He was a very prominent theater actor of the 60s and 70s. And he actually, of recent, has a reoccurring role on the 2022 FX show called The Old Man, which stars Jeff Bridges.
Oh, really?
It's a drama thriller, and it sounds really cool, actually. I'm going to check it out after Jess and I wrap up the offer, I think. But anyway, he also recently had a cameo in the movie Tick, Tick, Boom with
Andrew Garfield.
Andrew Garfield, yes. So you've seen him in that of recent. Also, a little fun fact: he's Jennifer Grey's dad. So the actor from Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Dirty Dancing.
Wow, a lot of a familial relation.
A lot of nepotism in Hollywood.
A lot of nepotism in Hollywood. Yeah. By the way, when you get married, that's how I'm gonna dress when I MC your wedding. Is white powder, like the full suit and everything.
Money makes the world go round, the world go round.
Until you have to like escort me off the premises.
So we have a couple other characters that I just want to quickly mention, and this is almost something that we we skipped over in the plot because it's a little bit of a side plot detail.
It's
There's two other
it's a B plot.
yeah, there's two kind of actors circling around this B plot. There's Fritz Wendell, who's a German
Ladies man.
yeah, or no, he's not from Germany. Is he Austrian? I can't remember exactly where he's from. But he's also somebody who's kind of come to Berlin at this very interesting moment in time.
Yeah.
He's trying to learn English because that's how Brian's supporting himself in Berlin, is teaching people English. And he falls in love with a wealthy Jewish woman named Natalia Launder. Yeah.
It starts with an L.
Landor. Something like
Laundry.
that. Yeah, I can't pronounce her name.
We're doing our best.
Yeah, so those two are kind of the side plot of will they, won't they. They're both kind of part of the Brian Berlin 1931 Learn English troupe.
Kinda. You know, it's funny. It wasn't until just now, watching you try to pronounce her last name, that I thought it is kind of like maybe I didn't appreciate up until now that the three main characters are all not native to Berlin.
Yeah.
It's almost like people come into New York seeking new opportunities.
Right. And yeah, maybe Berlin is kind of at an interesting, well, it definitely is at an interesting crossroads in 1931, but
sure is.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Sally's American, Brian's British, and Fritz is from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. From Fritzland.
Yeah. And so Natalie and Fritz are not necessarily well-known actors in North American audiences, but Fritz is actually played by Fritz Wepper, who's been starring in a German sitcom since 2002, actually, called Himmels Willen, which is For Heaven's Sake, which apparently is a very popular German sitcom.
And it's been going on for, what, 21 years?
Yeah.
Huh.
And he's been a series regular since. Our last character that I want to quickly mention is Baron Maximilian von Haun, the very wealthy socialite that...
He's a baron.
Yes.
Yeah.
That Sally and Brian meet and have a very interesting experience with throughout the film. And I don't want to go into too much more details than that for spoiler reasons. Our director is Brian Fosse, a very prominent director and choreographer of musical works both on stage and on the screen. So he did the stage musicals, The Pajama Game, Damn Yankees, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, Sweet Charity, Pippin, and Chicago. Kind of an important...
The first few musicals you just mentioned all sounded made up.
Yeah, but Chicago.
Yeah, I've heard of Chicago.
He also did a few other films that were very relevant and famous called Lenny and All That Jazz. All That Jazz was actually a semi-autobiographical film based on his life.
Oh, really? I hope someday there's a musical based on my life.
Yeah.
I hope you star in it.
Cool. Fosse is known for having like a very specific type of choreography, which is the turned in knees and jazz hands in his films. So that if you've seen those, he's credited as kind of being the guy who
the jazz
put
hands
those
guy.
on the map. Yeah.
Huh.
He actually won a Tony, an Emmy, and an Oscar all in the same year when he won his Oscar for Best Director on this one.
So in 1972 was a good year for him.
Well, 73. Yes.
Right.
All those awards. But yeah, the only person to ever do that. So who is this movie for? Obviously, we've said this is a very queer-friendly film.
Yeah. It's kind of startling how modern it feels in that respect. I mean.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I agree with that. Like that aspect of the film is modern, even though maybe some of the other.
Actually, I might walk that back a little bit.
Because
there is something that happens later in the movie that was definitely more shocking 30 years ago.
Well, okay, so here's the thing, is I would say it feels more modern in the sense that it's not painting these people as black or white, good or bad. It's kind of portraying something that is complicated in a complicated light. Like
Yeah.
Like,
okay.
It's not Hollywoodifying it's Hollywoodifying things, but it's not completely Hollywoodifying their relationships and who these people are.
Yeah. This movie is darker than it seems on first glance, too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
There's stuff that happened. There's stuff going on that especially nowadays with stuff maybe going on in the world.
Well, and that's actually kind of interesting as well, is because it's painting like the queer community against the backdrop of the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany.
The alt-right.
Yeah, exactly. So there's kind of an interesting mirror to some events going on in real life. So I think that it's kind of somewhat a little timeless in that regard.
Yeah, it's like kind of the clash between like free-spirited liberation and like oppression.
Right.
Maybe. I'm trying to be tasteful. I hope I'm not saying anything stupid.
No,
but
I don't think so.
I don't think so. I don't want to sound Hufflepuff right now.
I think also people who really like weighty musicals are gonna like this one. Like this is a very heavy in themes and plot kind of musical, and like we kind of talked about, the music is, what did you use the word, didactic?
Didactic. No, not didactic. Diegetic.
Diegetic.
So that means it takes place within the world.
Right. Yes. So it's not your typical musical in that sense, and in that regard, it's kind of nice alternative. Like if you're kind of going through a list of musicals to watch.
It's almost barely a musical.
Yeah.
You can almost trick someone into watching this movie without telling them it's a musical.
I also think that this movie pairs well with something like The Sound of Music, because it's almost like a more adult look at the 30s in Germany, and how the Nazi party came to power and kind of the oppression that brought.
One thing I really admired about this movie is that it takes place in 1931. And again, I'm not a huge student of history, but what's interesting is that at the beginning of the movie, the Nazis are definitely kicking around, but they're more treated as like a public nuisance.
Yes.
And that's kind of interesting. There's a great scene early on where there's a Nazi invades the Kit Kat Club. And
this is the opening scene.
Yeah. The owner just chucks him out. He's like, "Yeah, get out of here.
Right.
You pesky Nazi."
Yeah.
So,
and over the course of the movie, that drastically changes.
Yeah.
So I think those are kind of the main who this movie is for. Does this movie hold up? This is the other kind of part that we talk about during this part of the film. And where I want to lead off with that discussion is that I find this movie has very slow pacing.
It's funny how The Godfather was an hour longer.
Yes.
But it felt a lot faster.
Yes.
This movie, there were parts where I was like, okay, is the movie over yet? Or like, are we getting there? Like,
yes.
So, and I think that's partly the format is like every 5 minutes or 5 or 10 minutes, there's these musical breaks.
Right.
And it's hard not to feel like they're intermissions. Like it's the format is neat at first, but it does kind of wear thin as the movie goes on.
Yeah, I would agree with you. So I don't know if this movie holds up to a modern watch. Like it doesn't.
It doesn't hold up as well as The Godfather, that's for sure.
Yes, and that's where the contrast of where we're coming into this film with is, and what our objective was as well, is comparing two very relevant movies in the Oscar year that they won their awards in. And you're right, like The Godfather, just the pacing and the structure of the film just holds up so much better because this is a film that calls back to a previous moment in Hollywood, and a previous moment on Broadway. Whereas The Godfather is the precursor to all of modern cinema.
The Godfather also just felt, like I mentioned when we talked about this a couple weeks ago, it felt like mythic and timeless.
Right.
Whereas this movie maybe doesn't. And I think part of the problem is, like, you're not a big musical fan, are you?
I actually don't mind a good musical every once in a while.
Yeah, I don't mind a good musical either, but when was the last time you watched a musical?
Jess and I over the summer watched Hamilton.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough.
I watch probably 1 to 2 musicals a year, and then I like to go to musicals or like live stage productions once every couple of years as well.
Oh, really?
To see kind of what's playing. Yeah.
Okay.
I've seen some really cool stuff live.
Huh. Okay. Well, you kind of ruined the point I was trying to make, but I guess for someone like me, like I feel like I don't really watch musicals, and I think it's definitely a genre that is a little underexposed right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree.
So, I mean really the only really musicals I could probably name are like the Disney Renaissance musicals. Mm-hmm. So, the format is a little interesting.
Well, even we already talked about how like this one is kind of unique even within that format and that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's somewhat of a hard movie to talk about because it's It's not perfect by any means. It's not a perfect movie, and
No,
it hasn't held up perfectly over time,
it
which is
has
very interesting.
it has not aged as gracefully as a movie that came out the same year.
Yeah, exactly. When to watch. This film is really weighty in its themes,
Yeah.
and you have to be kind of fully invested while watching this. Or maybe you don't because it moves at such a slow pace. I could be talked into either one if you have an opinion one way or another.
I watched it today,
Yeah.
like in the afternoon.
Yeah.
I think I might have enjoyed it more in the evening, if that makes sense.
My when to watch recommendation was actually Sunday evening is
Okay.
where I would watch this. I it's not a blockbuster movie by any means, so it doesn't go on like your Friday night, your big Saturday night kind of movie main focus kind of thing. It's like a Sunday evening, you're kind of winding down, ready to go to work the next day kind of thing.
You know what? Actually, I'm just thinking about this now. I think I might have enjoyed watching this movie more in theaters because I think those big musical numbers would have popped a lot more.
Yeah, and you know what? There's something to be said as well about seeing it with more people. Like it might have
Yeah.
the vibe of the room might have kind of moved things along a little bit better as well.
Yeah, and like there are two really specific musical moments that do slap pretty hard.
Yeah,
And
I will agree.
I think you know the ones I'm talking about.
Yeah,
I
there's a
feel,
couple that I want to talk about later when we get into sound and talk about our favorite ones for
okay.
sure. Um,
So I guess I didn't really give you an answer, but we kind of talked around it for a while.
yeah,
So watch it whenever you feel like it.
I
Do your
like Sunday
best.
evening. I like Sunday evening,
Okay.
but this one isn't for everyone. Not every. I wouldn't recommend this one to everyone. I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I don't know if I recommend this to most people.
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know that I would recommend this to myself, but
But anyway, so where to watch? So this one is on Hollywood Suite, which you can either get your own subscription for or through Prime. I never heard of this one before
yeah,
this episode,
first I'm hearing of it.
but looks like a good streaming platform if you're looking for like previous Oscar winner films of previous decades. Like it really looks like it focuses on pre-2000s kind of films, which
Like
is
kind of like
our base.
what we do.
Yeah, exactly. So
Huh.
it's kind of a neat little streaming platform.
Fun.
With that, we're kind of done our first part of this episode. So, yeah, I hope at this point you've either been intrigued and want to check this musical out. And if you do, come back and listen to us as we talk next week about our deep dive of this film.
Yeah, it'll be divine.
Yeah. You know what? Before we want to wrap up, too, I was thinking, do you want to talk this year's Oscars at all whatsoever?
I mean,
Is there any films in this year's Oscars that you want to discuss? Because this is your one
this
and
is my
only
one
opportunity
chance.
to do it.
Oh
Yes.
man. I mean, to be honest, I never really pay that much attention to the Oscar season.
Mhm.
You listed off all the movies that have been nominated this year, and I haven't heard of some of them.
Right.
So, I mean, I guess maybe all I'll say while I have the opportunity to say it is that, I hope Everything Everywhere All at Once kicks everyone's ass.
I very much agree.
Michelle Yeoh deserves it.
Yep.
The director deserves it.
Hee Kwan deserves it.
Yeah, that guy. So,
Every aspect of that film I absolutely loved. I from the get-go, like I saw the trailer like I don't know 2 years ago almost now, and I was like, this is a movie for me, and I'm just so happy that it went on to be as successful as it did, and I hope that
yeah, like if we're talking about cinematic moments in 2022, probably that and Batman are the only two movies I saw. No, that Batman and The Menu were the only movies I saw in theaters that I really, really enjoyed.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you liked The Menu. We haven't talked about that at all on the podcast, and it's not nominated for any awards, but I'm a huge fan of The Menu.
I enjoyed it. Maybe not as much as you did, but it's funny. I was on a date and we were supposed to go see the new Black Panther, but we kind of just decided that neither of us really cared enough to go see it. So she pulled out her phone and just picked The Menu at random. All we knew about it was a thriller, and yeah, we had a really good time.
Yeah, that one's kind of right up my alley kind of movie. I guess the only other film that we could maybe quickly discuss is Banshees of Inisherin.
Yeah. Okay, that one too.
Yeah, so that one's also kind of one that's interesting this Oscars race. It feels like, it's a top contender in a few different races. You and I watched it together actually
On New Year's Eve.
Yeah, on New Year's Eve, and we had very different responses to the film.
Yeah.
I think you were much higher on the film than I was.
I think I was, yeah.
For me, like, I think I really loved aspects of the film. I loved the cinematography and just everything about Ireland and seeing this little Irish town and island at this period in time during the Civil War. But for me personally, I think the problem that I had with the film is actually less to do with the film and a little bit more to do with me, because I walked in this film thinking that this was going to be a comedy about two Irish men who decide that they can't be friends anymore, or one of them decides he can't be friends with the other anymore, and it's how the other guy kind of responds to that. Because, you know, I'm getting older, and I've seen that. I've seen that in my own personal life. I've seen somebody, very close friends, decide, you know what, I don't want to be friends with you anymore, and just walk away. And it's a very interesting thing to happen to somebody.
It's heartbreaking. I think you and I have both been in situations with friends where you kind of have to, it's almost like you're quiet quitting a friendship. You're just like, so like, I still love you, but this isn't working.
And sometimes it's not quiet quitting. In this case, it's very much not about quiet quitting.
Loud quitting, yeah.
And that doesn't happen very often. And when it does, it's such an experience that's hard to describe for anyone who's never been through it. But it's not a pleasant experience by any means. It feels like somebody's died, and it's something that's really hard to conceptualize and grasp.
Yeah, I mean, with breakups, it's like, yeah, everybody's been dumped. Like, we all know how it feels.
Right.
And if you don't, like, brace yourself because it's coming. But yeah, no, it's really, I will say though, the movie, it did still kind of strike me as a comedy. Like, it was funny.
Yeah, it was a comedy, but it was a film that was more like a fairy tale about the Irish Civil War than it was about two men deciding that they didn't want to be friends anymore.
Kind of. I think one of the things I liked about it so much is that it is so hard to describe.
Yeah.
You know, and there is something really enigmatic. Like, you know, you're describing it as a fairy tale about the Irish Civil War. I don't even really know how I would describe it. Because, like, I think I was telling my mom about it, and I was like, so it's these two guys who decide they don't want to be friends anymore. And she was like, oh, and that's the whole movie? And it's like, yeah, kind of. Like,
kind of.
Kind
of.
But, like,
it is a very hard movie to talk about. And it also kind of has somewhat of a little bit of an ambiguous ending, and
extremely ambiguous ending.
Talked about this on our podcast before, whereas I'm really down on ambiguous endings.
That's right. I did forget that about you.
Yeah. Whereas you tend to like ambiguous endings much more than I do.
Well, we've talked about this before about how, like, to me, the sign of a good movie is how long it lingers with you.
Right.
And there's something about, I don't know, like, the ending of that movie in particular was kind of, I don't want to say unsettling, but it was a little unsettling.
Right.
And I kind of, like, I appreciated that.
Anyway.
We should do a full episode on it at some point. I know that's not really our vibe, but maybe
I'm less high on it, so I don't know if we could. I don't know.
I'll have to start my own podcast just to talk about it.
Yeah. You or Jason, maybe. If Jason's likes that movie as much as you do, then you two are welcome to run an episode on that one.
Right.
Call it Jekyll's Corner.
Or just call it Are You Rowing? ?
But anyway, I think that's it for our episode. We should probably wrap her up. And
that was almost half an episode on Banshees.
Yeah.
So tough shit. It made it into the podcast.
Yep. So we will see you next week for a deep dive on Cabaret.
Everything was going really well until he cut all his fingers off.